Hello, everyone. We still have a few people logging in, so we'll give them just a minute to get connected and then we'll get started. Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining the Link Center for this shared learning group focused on the topic of navigating risky behaviors. I'm going to go over a few housekeeping items while we get started. The session is being recorded, and the recording and the transcript, along with the slide deck, will all be made available on our website. We welcome you to revisit the content yourself and share it with others. Attendees cannot see the names of other attendees, and all attendees are muted. Please use the chat function in Zoom to communicate with other attendees and with the host during the webinar. You can use the chat by clicking on chat at the bottom of the screen. Be aware that your name will appear in the chat if you make a comment. And if you'd like, you can change your display name by clicking the three dots next to your name and selecting Rename. We will have representatives from the Link Center watching the chat and responding throughout the session today. And if you'd like to submit a question or a comment privately to the host, you can do that by using the Q&A function or the chat. We do have live captioning and sign language interpreters present today. We will be spotlighting the active speaker and the sign language interpreter throughout the webinar. If you click on View on your Zoom screen, you can change the way you see the panelists. And if you're having any trouble with your view, please let us know that in the chat. At this time, I'm going to hand the floor over to Dr. Stacy Nonamaker, who's going to start today's presentation. Stacy, the floor is all yours.
Thanks so much, Stephanie, and hello, everyone. So great to be here with you today. I am very excited to hear from you all and to share with you all things that we've been thinking about around this topic of navigating risky behaviors. I'm going to start with a visual description of myself. I am a middle-aged white woman. I have glasses on. I have brown wavy hair to my shoulders. I'm in front of a white screen. I am wearing a white and black striped shirt with a black sweater over top of that. I am with NASDS, and NASDS is the National Association of State DD Directors, and we are one of the partners of the Link Center. And the Link Center is actually a grant that's funded by the Administration for Community Living. And one of the things that we do are these shared learning groups. And so we're so excited to be doing this shared learning group with you all. If you want to know more about the Link Center, if you haven't heard of us or feel like you don't know enough about us, here is the website link, as well as a QR code. And we'll also pop the link to the website into the chat for you all. And really, we're encouraging you to jump up on our website, take a look and at the things that we have collected for you all and others. In terms of, we have resources up there, we have information, we have some trainings, all really around how do we better support people who have co-occurring conditions. This is a new website for us, and we're certainly putting a lot of information up here, but we're continuously updating, we're continuously adding to what's up here. So check out our website and check back often to see what we have and what we're putting up there. Okay, so a little bit about these shared learning groups, just so that you have some more information about what these are. So we, every quarter, host 4 meetings. We hosted 2 yesterday, one for direct support professionals, one for clinical professionals, and then we're hosting 2 today. You're our last session of this quarter for this topic. Earlier today, we talked with families of people with lived experience. And today, now we're talking to you all, people with lived experience. And we're really encouraging people to not feel like they have to feel boxed in or choose one role that they may have. And we're just encouraging people to just jump on and hang out with us during these shared learning groups, because the information in all 4 of the presentations really is the same. But we tailor it a little bit. We make some changes here and there so that it is a little more specific to the group that we're talking to. The content and the information that you'll hear today is really created by the Link Center partners. If you go on our website, you'll see that we have many partners. Some of them you'll meet today. The Link Center partners include people with lived experience, researchers, and people who work on policy issues. As Stephanie said, today we're recording and transcribing the meeting, and that means that we're taking down all the words that people say in this meeting. And all of that, the recording, the transcription, plus any other materials we show you today will be posted on the Link Center website. And we encourage you to go on the website, find the information, and share it with others. So let's jump into today's agenda. And I see that some people already jumped in and they're saying hello in the chat. Would love to hear you say hello in the chat. Maybe put your name in there. Any group associations or memberships you want to put in there. Maybe tell us what state you're dialing in from. I am dialing in from Pennsylvania today. So as you're saying hello and dropping your name or other information in the chat, just a little bit more about what we're going to do today. So these are called shared learning groups, and I really want to emphasize the shared, because we're sharing with you what we are learning about this topic of navigating risky behaviors. And we want to hear from you and have you share with us what you're thinking about when you hear the words risky behaviors or navigating risky behaviors. And we really want to hear from you any resources, any trainings, any information that you go to get information about the topic. We're going to, after my colleagues and partners at the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network presents a bit, we're going to turn to you all and do a group exercise to really help us think about the topic of navigating risky behaviors and understand how you all think about the topic. And so we're going to be asking for audience participation at the end. But please feel free, if you have any questions or any comments, use the chat. We'd love to hear from you throughout our time together today. So the next few slides are just some ground setting. We just want to all be on the same page. And these slides were created by people who are on our steering committee, the Link Center Steering Committee, and they're people with lived experience. And I'll talk more about the steering committee in just a moment. But let's set the ground, the foundation, and that we're all on the same page. So this meeting, we'll be talking about people's experience in being supported. Some people have experienced trauma that makes it hard to recover and move forward. We want to encourage you all to take care of yourself, do what is necessary for your own comfort and care, whatever that looks like. And we want to remind you all that we should be gentle with ourselves and each other, because sometimes this is hard work to do. We celebrate that we are all individuals from different backgrounds, We celebrate that we have shared experiences to learn from, and we know that we are each unique with our own experiences in the world. And the Link Center really is happy to bring that diversity and embrace that diversity. And then we listen and share with open minds and kindness. We do not judge or blame others for what they share. And so we just want to create that space for you all to feel comfortable sharing your thoughts and your opinions as we talk through the topic today. So speaking of the topic, and I see that a lot of you had said hello in the chat, so it's so good to see you all. I'm glad that you're in the chat already. We'd love for you in the chat to help us understand when you think about the words risky behavior, what comes to mind for you? So that helps us understand where you all are coming from. Again, what comes to mind when you hear the words risky behavior? No wrong or right answer. Judging. Doing inappropriate stuff, unsafe, behavior that can slide into something worse. When someone is doing something that put themselves in danger or others, violence, substance abuse, trauma, reverting back to my unhealthy coping methods, self-harm, putting self in dangerous situations, eating food not supposed to be, no way out, negative consequences, misunderstandings. These are all so great. And again, these are all really helpful because it helps us understand what you're thinking and where your head is at when we say the words risky behaviors. Behavior that negatively impacts someone's mental health. Thank you all. Okay, as I said, we have a steering committee for the Link Center that's made up of 14 people with varied living experiences. So we have people that represent states across the nation. They guide and they drive the work of the Link Center. And I see a few of you who are on our steering committee who have joined us today. So hello to you all. As the steering committee, we met in person in September. And one of the topics that we talked about was navigating risky behaviors. And so what you're seeing in front of you is a graphic of that really great discussion that we had. And today you're going to hear some of these words and others that the steering committee shared with us throughout the content that will be shared. So I just want to pause for a second and I just want to give a huge thank you and acknowledge the steering committee's commitment to informing this work, the commitment for showing up, providing their thoughts, their ideas, and their experiences. And you'll hear that throughout today's content. Okay, here's where I get to turn it over to one of our Link Center partners, Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, and I will turn it over to Jules Good and Noor Pervez.
Thank you, Stacy. Hi, everyone. Great to be here with you today. My name is Jules Good. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm the programs coordinator at the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. Quick visual description. I'm a white person wearing glasses. I have short pink hair, and I'm wearing a black t-shirt with a brown kind of flannel over it. And I also just wanted to share as we get started today that I am a person with lived experience in this area. I'm dual diagnosed myself and have had experience navigating risky behaviors. And I know that a lot of us who are here today are in the same boat. So thanks for coming, and I will turn it over to Noor.
Thank you so much. Hi everyone, I'm Nor. I use he or they pronouns. I'm the Community Engagement Manager over at ASN. For a visual description, I'm a South Asian person with curly black hair piled up into a bun, tortoiseshell glasses, and wearing a white and blue flannel. And in the background, you can see kind of my office and the genderqueer flag behind my head. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So one of the first questions we got in chat is what we'd consider a risky behavior, which is a great place to start because unhelpfully, this is a question that when ASN did research, we found that when looking at what's considered a risky behavior or something in need of what's considered a behavior support, not everyone means the same thing when they talk about quote unquote behaviors that need intervention. So we're going to talk about why this is important later in the presentation, but to kind of introduce that idea, while literally a behavior is basically anything that you do, behaviors in air quotes or risky behaviors in this context usually mean something that is considered weird or disruptive that a disabled person is doing. You'll notice when I'm saying that weird and disruptive are both pretty vague and not super helpful because anything can be considered weird by someone. So, next slide. For the purposes of this presentation, we are narrowing this down when talking about risky behaviors to talk about basically things that can harm yourself or someone else. So we talk in this presentation about substance misuse. So to help define that a little bit, someone who is of legal drinking age, so someone who's 21 or older in America, going to a bar and having a drink with their friends is having a substance, they're having alcohol, but that's not misusing it. That's just kind of doing something that a bunch of adults do. Substance misuse would be basically stuff that puts people at risk of justice system involvement. So the police, the fire department, basically, if you're drinking so much or taking another drug so much that it's causing you to hurt yourself or someone else. So, for example, if you get really, really drunk and start a fire at a bar, that could be hurting other people. So, in that case, that's kind of where we draw the line and call that substance misuse. We also are going to talk about self-soothing, so calming yourself down in ways that can cause harm. So hair pulling, banging your head against the wall, biting yourself until you bleed. We can also talk in this context about trying to calm yourself down in ways that cause harm to others around you. So, for example, yelling or speaking angrily isn't inherently dangerous, and you might do that to try and feel less scared in a situation. But if you're making threats to other people while you're doing the yelling and screaming, that can cause harm to others around you because it can make them feel afraid or unsafe. So that would also fall into the category of harming yourself or someone else. Next slide, please. So when we talk about this, we're coming at this from the understanding that doing something risky doesn't make someone a bad person. Most of the time, someone doing something risky is not them trying to cause harm. Most of the time, it's someone trying to meet an unmet need. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means on the next slide. One thing that we talk about a lot in this presentation is the idea of dignity of risk, which is the idea that we have to take risks to learn and to grow. So someone taking an action that is risky might be a necessary step to them learning how to do something that they want or need to do. So for example, when we look at for people who are learning how to walk, assuming that that's something their body is set up to do, when folks are learning how to do that for the first time, they might struggle with their balance. They might have to pull themselves up on certain things. They might fall down a whole bunch. And in that process, they might like get cuts or bruises, they might fall down and bonk their arms or their legs on things. And we recognize that while that might make people feel uncomfortable, while it might make the person in question have some discomfort, we recognize that the risk involved in learning how to walk is making those mistakes because they're part of the process of figuring out how to do it, right? You can't start moving forward unless you figure out how to get up in the first place. And in the process, because you haven't done it before, you might fall. So that same idea applies to a lot of things in life where people are going to make mistakes and be messy and do things that they might regret later in the process of starting to understand how to do what they want to differently and to understand how to get their needs met in different ways as well. Next slide, please. So when looking at risky behaviors, these aren't things that come out of nowhere. They tend to show us an unmet need. So in the August Shared Learning Group, we talked about the social determinants of health, which is basically the idea that our environment, so the stuff around us, where we live, and our background, so the way that we grow up and the people we grow up around, can shape what we do. So basically, our choices are things that we decide to do, but they are influenced by and they grow from kind of what we have grown up in. The people we've grown up around, the places we've grown up around, and the things that we've done before, and how those actions have impacted us. Next slide, please. So when we look at other risk factors for risky behaviors, trauma, both individual, so stuff that happened to us one-to-one between one other person, can be a risk factor for more risky behaviors. And also structural trauma, so trauma that's built into the way society is made and the way society treats certain people, can also lead to trauma that can lead to a higher risk for someone doing risky behaviors to try and meet their needs. So individual trauma can look like things like child abuse, things like someone doing hate crime, someone physically or emotionally hurting you directly, and that causing mental and emotional, long-standing, longer problems, longer trouble inside. Structural issues start out or seem broader, but they kind of work like links in a chain and they lead to individual traumas. So for example, let's say that someone doesn't have a lot of money, their family doesn't have a lot of money. A lot of times when people are poor, they might live in areas where there's a lot of pollution. And when there's lots of pollution, we know based on research that people are likelier to get sick and get sick more often. And we also know that people are likelier to develop chronic illnesses. So things like asthma, things like chronic fatigue, things that basically are related to growing up in and around a lot of pollution. And for people who already have disabilities, these conditions can sometimes make those more significant and can make them more challenging or in some cases more expensive to deal with. For example, if you already have mobility trouble and then you get asthma, your mobility trouble might get worse because you have trouble breathing, which might lead to needing mobility equipment. And needing mobility equipment isn't a bad thing. Personally, I use a power chair. But the way that the world treats you is different when you're visibly different than people around you. So that can lead to smaller traumas or more of what are called microaggressions or small, very troubling things that happen throughout your day as a result of discrimination. So for example, when I'm in my power chair, if the elevator is out at the metro, oh, I might have to spend a whole hour or 2 hours trying to get to another station just to continue my trip because I have to find another way to get to the next station. And that on its own is annoying, but when you have to deal with problems like that every day, not just on transport, but in doctor's offices and when going to museums and when seeing friends and family who might not have accessible houses, all of that adds together and it can make you feel scared or worried or upset about even leaving your house. And that in and of itself is a form of trauma. So as a result of that, you can develop kind of this need to get your needs met, but also but also the way that you do it might be less well adjusted, might hurt yourself or other people, because that's the way your brain has learned to adapt to kind of this ongoing trauma, these ongoing problems, and the fear that comes out of that. So, question in the chat is, how does background relate to culture, historical, and gender issues? Great question. So when we talk about the 6 principles of trauma-informed care, basically these 6 ideas, so for folks who can't see, they are safety, trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, voice and choice, and cultural, historical, and gender issues. So when looking at these principles, basically these 6 ideas are things that folks who are trying to help people who have been through trauma are like doing things need to consider. So background in the sense of like, for example, where you grew up, who you grew up around, and sort of the culture of the environment you grew up in can change the way that you understand the world, and it can change the way that you interact with it. And that can be a positive thing, that can be a negative thing. It all depends on what the situation is and how you and your body and nervous system reacted to it, and also how other people treated you because of it, right? So when we talk about, for trauma-informed care, cultural, historical, and gender issues, what we mean is basically that when you're talking to someone about trying to navigate a problem they're dealing with, it's important to both listen to them when they talk about what's important to them as a result of all of those things. So their cultural background, their personal history, and gender issues in the sense of like how they feel about their gender, how other people treat them because of their gender, how the world treats them because of it. And also to think about structurally how all of those things can change the way that someone grows up, and how, as a result of the way they grew up, they might have faced different kinds of trauma, and how that might have changed their worldview or the way they think about trying to get their needs met. Because, for example, if someone is really, really used to not wanting to leave their house because they think the world is very inaccessible and has kind of moved that into the feeling of, so it's not worth going outside, it's important to not just immediately go, oh, well, that's ridiculous. There's no reason that is reasonable that they could have had a root for that. But when you look at historical and cultural issues here, if someone grew up disabled, for example, and grew up having a lot of ableism in the outside world, that's going to help you understand, okay, so the root of that fear is coming from the very real experience of being hurt by people and being hurt by the world because of their disability. So part of learning how to make it feel safer for them to go outside and to make it feel more possible for them to do things that they need to that involve going outside, it's going to involve working with that root fear, yeah? So it's kind of looking at the full picture of a person rather than just what you see right in front of you. Next slide, please. So other risk factors to think about here. A lack of communication supports. So that can look like a lack of language access for people who are deaf or hard of hearing, who might not be provided a chance to learn or use sign language. That can look like people who speak English as a second language not being given a chance to receive and learn information in their native language. That can also look like taking away access to AAC, so augmentative and alternative communication, forcing speech, not offering accessible communication or forms of it for people who are non-speaking. And as a result of that, that can lead to a lot of frustration. And in some cases, something that folks have pointed out in the last couple of sessions, sometimes it means that the only time people are paying attention to someone non-speaking is when they're engaging in something considered risky. And that in and of itself is a form of communication trying to get them to listen, right? So when folks aren't being provided communication supports, there is going to be increased frustration, increased friction, and higher chances of risky behaviors, both for self-soothing and for trying to get communication across. In the chat, Alicia notes, sometimes people don't get the right supports growing up. Think biographical timelines, good for finding residency skills, and also see how person being supported to figure out what supports will help them in the future to help improve outcomes. I use art to communicate. I spent half my life trying to figure to be heard through visual communication. Yeah, absolutely. And that's an example of people needing to work with communication there and what's provided. One film that we talk about when talking about how a lack of communication supports can impact folks is the film This Is Not About Me, which is a documentary about Jordan Zimmerman, who is autistic and non-speaking, that was created by AssistiveWare, which is an AAC provider. So the film talks about basically how when Jordan did not have communication supports provided, a lot of her day-to-day experience was people assuming incompetence and not treating her well and treating her like she couldn't learn things or that she didn't want to engage with people. And as a result, often the only time people really were paying attention or listening to her was when she was behaving in a way that was considered risky, eloping, running down the halls, making loud noises, whatever, because that was the only time people were attempting to communicate in any way. And it's deeply, deeply unfair. And then when she had access to communication, suddenly everything changed because people, while they still were treating her differently, they could understand what she was saying, and that dramatically changed their understanding of how much she understood. And it's not fair that they assumed incompetence before she had that device, but the example of that film shows just how dramatically different her experience in her day-to-day life was, and how different her level of frustration was based on access to those supports. One steering committee member mentions that sensory needs need to be taken seriously and seen as an integral part of mental health care. Our culture does not make time for breaks and meeting bodily needs. So that is also a risk factor for risky behavior, because not meeting sensory needs can make it so that people are more frustrated and are going to try and meet their needs as quickly as possible, and sometimes in ways that are not what they intend or are ideal for the situation. Next slide, please. So when thinking about risky behaviors, it's also important to think about why a lot of people who aren't disabled also engage in things that are considered quote unquote risky. For example, the need for connection. So if someone goes to a bar and maybe drinks a little bit too much, they might be dealing with social anxiety or overstimulation or trying to fit in. And those are all things that happen with disabled folks too. Preaching to the choir, I know folks know this, but in general, like, there's a tendency for folks to assume that these things are coming out of nowhere, when in reality, it's usually to meet an underlying need. In the chat, Alicia notes, the healthcare system doesn't make room for alternative communication, and when they don't, it takes away our voice in care. Yes, I agree. And that also can increase a lack of understanding around how risky behaviors work, because it becomes a thing where they're paying attention to what's right in front of them rather than the root of the problem, which is that they're not listening to someone speaking to them using their device or using their method of communication otherwise. Yes, it can cause misdiagnosis too, which Alicia notes in the chat. Disabled people are often held to a higher standard because everything we do is medicalized. So the example I frequently give is of a professor friend who teaches a disability studies class, and she usually introduces her class with a question, which is, hey, so I've got a friend. He's 22, he lives with his mom, and he has kind of a messy room. He's not in college and he's not looking for a job. What advice would you give to my friend? And people immediately made a lot of suggestions, ranging from vocational rehab and counseling all the way up to a day program, and in the most extreme case, institutionalization. And the teacher just kind of paused and looked at them and was like, I never said the person was disabled. And you could just kind of see everyone's faces drop because they realized that they'd made an assumption that if someone was disabled, well, they needed all of these additional supports and there was inherently a problem, when in that same situation, if someone wasn't disabled, they wouldn't have made most of those suggestions, because someone people have in their brain not thought of as being disabled, who's just a 22-year-old person who's maybe a little bit, like has a little bit of a messy room and maybe isn't going to school or going to work right now, people don't immediately assume that that's something that needs outside help. Whereas when someone has a disability and is doing those things, they assume they need outside help. And people can have good or bad ideas about either person in that situation, but the fact is, at the heart of it, that they only assume that one of those two people is having a problem. So the phrase that I come back to a lot is that the pain you know is better than the pain you don't. So when people are getting their needs met in a way that's not ideal for them, it can seem like it's just a bad decision, when in reality, it's usually that people are seeking the pain that they think is going to be less bad, and the pain that is more familiar is usually what fits that situation. If someone is familiar with being a little too drunk and feeling a little bit less overwhelmed in a bar, the idea of having the physical pain of being overwhelmed and the emotional anxiety of being around friends while you're completely sober might feel scary and foreign and unusual. So between those two, people are going to pick what they're more familiar with, even if it's not necessarily the choice that's going to benefit them the most in that situation. So when looking at risk factors for risky situations, I think that's an important thing to consider. Sorry, I'm reading Emily's message in the chat here. Yes, so this also touches on some of the things we're going over on this slide, which is that there are a few supports that really truly accommodate dual diagnosed people. So people diagnosed with both an intellectual or developmental disability or a cognitive disability, as well as a mental health disability. One recent example is an Oregon man who was denied mental health support because clinicians thought his symptoms were just risky behaviors attached to his other diagnosis. So this is an example of what's called diagnostic overshadowing, which is basically a way to say that everything someone experiences is only because of one diagnosis, instead of recognizing that we might have more than one problem, more than one diagnosis at once. So for example, if someone sees me feeling sad or depressed while outside, or if someone notices that I've been having trouble sleeping for months and months on end, Someone might look at that and just go, oh, well, I mean, autistic people always have trouble sleeping, so that sucks, but that's just something that is part of autism. When in practice, that could be, for some people, a sign of an additional sleep disorder. So in that case, if I have an additional sleep disability and I haven't been tested for it, then that's diagnostic overshadowing because the doctor or the person doing diagnosis isn't willing to let me look into that additional condition and try to make sure that it's not there. Next slide, please. So now we're going to go ahead and transition into talking about how we support people doing risky behaviors, and I'm going to go ahead and pass that to Jules.
Thank you, Nor. When we're thinking about supporting people who are doing risky behaviors or advocating for the type of support that we might want when we might be engaging in risky behaviors, something that's really useful is kind of changing the way that we think about approaching risky behaviors. So right now, a lot of times, if someone's trying to get support for a risky behavior, they're getting quote unquote support or treatment that uses what we call a punitive lens. And what that boils down to basically is saying, if you keep doing this behavior, you're going to be punished. And that's a problem for a lot of different reasons that we're going to get into more throughout the rest of the presentation. But first I want to talk about what we want to be moving toward instead of a punitive lens, which is what we call a restorative lens. And with a restorative lens, what we say is, okay, let's figure out why you're doing this behavior so that we can stop any or reduce the amount of harm that's happening because of the behavior, and also address the reasons that it might be happening. And when we're moving towards a restorative lens, it's really important to think about accountability. So accountability does not mean that we punish someone and then give up on them. It means that we help people understand natural consequences and repair harm. So natural consequences are things that happen as a direct result of a behavior. So let's say you are walking around with your shoes untied and you trip and fall on your shoelace. The tripping and falling is a natural consequence from walking around without your shoelaces on. If someone saw you trip and fall and then said, oh my gosh, your shoes aren't tied, that's bad, you don't get to use your iPad for a week. That's not a natural consequence, right? Like that's something that happens on top of the direct result of walking around with your shoes untied. And so when we move towards a restorative lens, we kind of want to reduce or get rid of those unnatural consequences and instead focus on addressing the natural consequences and repairing the harm or the damage or the trouble that comes from that. A big part of being able to move towards a restorative lens is identifying the needs that are behind a behavior. So one of our steering committee members, Perry, said, observe the context behind a behavior. Don't just assume the person is doing it on purpose. And another steering committee member, Micah, said, these behaviors don't just come from nowhere. We have to think about the unmet need. People need to have choices in their day. And I think what both of these quotes are getting at is when someone's doing a risky behavior, like we said, it doesn't make them a bad person. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing the behavior on purpose. They're probably doing it because there's something difficult that they're dealing with and they don't have a better way of dealing with it or coping with it in that moment. So as an example, let's say that I'm feeling really angry and I need to do something with that anger. And so I throw this mug across the room. Well, if my friend is in the room with me and I throw the mug, she is maybe going to feel scared because she doesn't feel safe if she's in a room with someone who's throwing stuff around, right? So what we are seeing here is that there are two needs in the situation. There's my need to release anger and my friend's need to feel safe. How can we meet both of those needs? Well, maybe that means that I find a different way to release my anger. So maybe I go into another room and, you know, where there's no people and it's safer to kind of have a moment. Or I find a quieter or less disruptive way to release that anger so that if I'm in a room with other people, it doesn't scare them. And so in this situation, it's really kind of about figuring out sorry, brain injury moment. Figuring out how to meet both needs. And Alicia asked a great question in the chat. What happens when needs are known, but a person's support person continues to ignore their needs? Yeah, so what we know often happens when this is the case is that a person is going to keep doing the risky behavior. And if they feel like they're being ignored and their needs aren't being met, the behavior might even escalate or get worse because they're continuing to face the problem and not get the support that they need. And that's a situation where we would need to figure something out with the support person and get to the bottom of why the needs are not being met. So a metaphor that I really like to show people when talking about this, when talking about navigating risky behaviors, is from somebody named Richie Reseda, who is a social justice practitioner. He has an organization where it's called the Anti-Recidivism Coalition, which means that he helps people who are either currently in jail or who have been to jail before. He helps them he tries to help them not go back to jail. So the thing that he shares that I'm going to quote here is called detangling hair. So he says, "Justice is like detangling hair. We start with our and each other's actions, then carefully follow them back to the human needs those actions are based in. Just like we start with the ends of our hair and follow them back to the roots. Then we rearrange our actions in a way that respects everyone's needs. We can't get frustrated and cut someone's actions from the context of their needs, just like we can't just cut our hair off when detangling. It's the commitment to contextualizing people's actions and their needs that allows us to transform harm rather than cancel, commit war, and incarcerate each other." So basically what Richie Reseda is saying here is that when somebody is doing a risky behavior, we can't just look at the behavior itself. We have to look at why it's happening, and we need to address the root causes of the behavior while also supporting someone through the consequences of the behavior. And a really important part of allowing that to happen is making sure that we actually understand what people are going through and what's causing the behavior. It's really hard to support people when we don't understand them and when we don't understand why they're really doing something. Assessment, both formal and informal. So an example of a formal assessment would be like a form that your doctor fills out when they meet with you, and they check off boxes and write things down about what they're noticing. Informal assessment kind of just means you're witnessing or you're looking at a situation and thinking about it in your mind. But whether it's formal or informal, we can't just kind of project our own judgment and biases about what we're seeing onto someone. We have to actually listen to them. Yeah, Pavi in the chat just said, I think it's like emotional intelligence. That's exactly what it is. It's about having empathy and being able to think about what someone is going through without judging them or without relating it back to how you would handle the situation. And part of getting to that place of true understanding is understanding how somebody's culture and background and values play a big role. So it's important to recognize that what might be considered risky in one culture might not be considered risky in another culture. So as an example, in some cultures, casually or jokingly insulting someone is considered rude, right? Like teasing someone is not okay in some cultures. But in other cultures, it's a sign of affection to maybe like jokingly tease your friends, right? So that's important to consider when we're thinking about the reasons why someone might be doing a behavior and the consequences that are coming from them doing that behavior. At the same time, we have to remember that not everyone from the same place or background is the same. And also that not everybody who comes from a specific place or culture wants to stick to the norms of that culture as they grow up and develop their own personal beliefs and knowledge. So it's really important to both understand how somebody's culture or background might help us understand what they're doing and why they're doing it, but it's also not the only explanation, or it's just one smaller part of a bigger picture. And kind of going back to that emotional intelligence piece, we want to think about approaching supporting people who are navigating risky behaviors, approaching that with curiosity instead of judgment. So curiosity means that we are observing and learning about what's happening without saying things like, I think the person should do this, or I wouldn't do that if I was them, right? Those are all judgments. And so when we approach things with curiosity instead of judgment, it kind of opens up in our mind more possibilities for why somebody could be doing something. So for example, if I see someone who looks upset, maybe my first thought is, ooh, they must be angry. But if I approach them and try to support them through the lens of they're angry and they're not actually angry, then the support that I'm giving probably won't help, because that's not actually what the problem is. But if I see someone who's upset and I go, okay, they could be angry, they could be tired, they could be hungry, they could be overstimulated, and try to get more information to kind of broaden the possibilities of what it could be. That's a really a more helpful way to go about trying to support someone, because often what you perceive at first glance is not always what is actually going on. And Pavi asks, is it like how to read people's feelings? Yeah, I think that's a part of it. I think it's understanding. It's not just reading people's feelings in the way that like you have to like read people's feelings and they just expect you to know what they are. It's more like noticing what you think someone is feeling and then thinking about what the other options are for how they could be feeling. And like Reed says, yes, having empathy as well. Ooh, there we go. So another really big part of approaching with curiosity instead of judgment and figuring out the best way to support someone is making sure that they feel safe, because it's really, really hard to receive support and make the most of it if you don't feel safe in the place or with the people that are supporting you. And one of the biggest barriers to people feeling safe is if they feel ashamed. And what this can look like sometimes is if we're doing a behavior and someone says, that behavior is bad, you need to stop doing it or you're going to be punished. What that can sound like to us is, if I do this behavior, I can't tell you about it because I'm going to get in trouble. So I need to hide it. So shame doesn't stop people from doing a behavior. It makes it more likely that they're going to hide the behavior from you, which can increase those feelings of guilt and fear and shame, and actually increase the amount of harm that's being done to someone. It's important to remember that oftentimes when we're struggling, even if the main thing that we're thinking isn't like, oh, I'm afraid of something, there is always an element of fear or worry that we're feeling when we're struggling with something. And when we're feeling afraid, being punished is not going to help us, and being shamed is not going to help us. Connecting with people who are supportive and who can make space for our big feelings is the thing that's going to help us, is a big thing that's going to help us. So kind of the quote unquote cure for fear is not punishment, it's connection. Another metaphor that I like to use for this is saying that dough can't rise in a cold room. So, you know, when you're making bread, you make your dough and it has to proof so that it can rise before you put it in the oven. It has to do that in a warm environment, or else it will stay flat and it won't work. So just like you can't proof dough, or dough can't rise in a cold room, people can't reduce harm or work towards healing in a hostile environment. So if we don't feel safe, and we feel judged and shamed, it's really hard to work towards healing. Another thing I wanted to bring up, kind of related to this, one of our steering committee members, Micah, said, we need people to check in with us after meltdowns instead of just leaving us on our own. And I thought this was so important to bring up, because oftentimes when we're talking about risky behaviors, we talk about preventing them and dealing with them in the moment, but we really don't talk very much about what happens after we do the behavior, in terms of like how we take care of ourselves and how we care for a person who's doing a behavior. And so thinking about aftercare and how somebody wants to be supported after they've engaged in a risky behavior, after they've experienced that harm, is really important. Some people might want some space and time to decompress and think. Some people might want somebody to just sit there with them. Some people might want to talk it out. There's lots of different ways that people might want to be supported after experiencing something like this. And some of the tools that we're going to share towards the end of our presentation will tell us more about how we can plan for that aftercare piece. So we've kind of talked about, if we go back to our detangling hair metaphor, we've kind of talked about how we get to the root, right? How we might be able to figure out why something is happening, why somebody is doing a risky behavior. But now we're going to talk about how do we actually deal with that tangled bit? How do we deal with kind of the behavior itself? And Alicia, I saw that you asked in the chat, is there a way to get a copy of the PowerPoint? Yes, it's going to be posted with the recording of this webinar on the Link Center website, so you can look at it whenever you want after it's published. So one way that we can think about dealing with that tangled bit, dealing with the risky behavior, is through harm reduction. So you might have heard about harm reduction as it relates to substance misuse. So in that context, usually what it means is if someone is misusing a substance, oftentimes the way that people try to deal with that is by getting them to completely stop using the substance and stop using it like immediately. But that's not realistic for a lot of people, especially because a lot of times people are misusing substances because there's a bigger problem going on at the root, right? And so harm reduction is a way for us to make sure that if someone is going to be misusing a substance, or kind of in a zoomed out view, if someone is going to be engaging in a risky behavior, we can help them do that in a way where they're not hurting themselves more. And the reason that harm reduction is so effective is because it takes the shame and the stigma out of the behavior. So like we talked about earlier, right? If you're afraid that you're going to be judged and punished for doing something, then you're going to do it where no one can see you doing it. You're going to hide it, and that makes the problem worse. With harm reduction, we can be open and honest about what we're doing and how we're feeling, so that it's easier for us to get the help that we need. So here's an example of how we might use harm reduction for someone who is self-harming by cutting themselves. So there are the kind of tools of harm reduction, the like tangible things we can touch that are a part of it. So for someone who's cutting, we might want to make sure that they have sterile blades, because if you're cutting yourself with a rusty or a dirty blade, it's more likely that you're going to get a blood infection, which can really, really hurt you. We want to make sure that they have access to a first aid kit and proper wound care training, so that we make sure they're not cutting themselves in a place on their body that could cause them to bleed out. And we make sure that if they are bleeding too much, that they know how to stop the bleeding quickly before they get really, really hurt. Another part of harm reduction can be tapering. So tapering means that we try to, instead of trying to get someone to totally stop doing something, we try to reduce the amount or the intensity that they're doing it over time. So for someone who's cutting, let's say we have a person who's cutting their whole forearm. Maybe our tapering goal for this next week is to try to keep any new cuts in a smaller area of the arm for that next week. Or if someone is cutting every day, maybe our tapering goal for the next week is to have one day that week where they don't cut at all. And then once we like accomplish those goals, then we can keep, you know, setting like a little bit bigger goals over time, until we get them to a place where, they're no longer harming themselves in that way. So again, one of the key parts of harm reduction is eliminating or getting rid of shame and judgment as much as possible. So if we're trying to do harm reduction, trying to use harm reduction tools, but we're still shaming somebody or keeping them in a stressful care environment, it's not going to work very well. And it's also important to remember, back to our detangling hair metaphor, right? Our harm reduction strategies help us deal with the tangled bit, and our kind of assessing and understanding strategies help us deal with the root. And we have to do both at the same time to get the hair to a place where it's untangled and it can grow freely and healthily, right? So in other words, we can't work on trying to change a behavior very well without learning how to meet the unmet need that's causing the behavior. One of our steering committee members, Emily, said self-harm can feel like a way to take control, which is a really great example of how a behavior can come from an unmet need. So if someone doesn't feel like they have control, self-harm can feel like a way for them to get that control. And Danielle said, self-injury for stimming versus for self-punishment are different things. Taking it out on yourself instead of someone else because you'll get in less trouble. And this goes back to what we were talking about, kind of questioning the why of a behavior. So you might have two people who are doing the exact same behavior, but the reasons why are very different. So let's say you have two people who are both hitting themselves in the head. One person might be doing it because they like the way that it feels, and one person might be doing it because they're feeling really angry at the person next to them and they want to hit them, but they know that if they hit that person, they're going to get in a lot of trouble, so they hit themselves instead. So even though both of these people are hitting themselves, the way that we help them to stop hitting themselves is different because they're doing it for different reasons. So for the person who's doing it because it feels good, maybe we find another thing that gives them a similar sensory sensation, so that they can still get that good feeling without hurting themselves. For the person who's doing it because they're angry, maybe we figure out other ways to deal with that anger. We've talked a lot about risk factors and kind of the bad or hard things that are happening in a person's life that can cause them to do risky behaviors. But we also want to talk about protective factors. So protective factors are parts of a person's life that can help them be safe and happy. And protective factors are often the things that can help people stop doing risky behaviors. So positive relationships with our caregivers, family, friends, and healthcare providers are a big protective factor for people. And like we were talking about earlier with communication, having access to consistent access to full communication is another huge protective factor, because when you can communicate, it's a lot easier to deal with other people and move through the world, right? Micah said, we need to use strength-based interventions. Protective factors can help us keep people in a better state of mind. So a lot of times when we're talking about risky behaviors, we're focusing on what's going wrong for someone, but we also want to focus on what's going well for someone, because if we can kind of ride that momentum of things that are going well and use that to help us learn how we can make other things go well for someone, then we can kind of tip the scales towards that more positive side of things in someone's life. I'm just going to look at the chat real quick. So Alicia asks, is this where resiliency skills come in? Yeah, I think that with harm reduction, like it is a difficult process, especially when we're talking about things like tapering, right? Like we're asking someone to make consistent progress towards a goal, which can be really hard. And so resiliency skills are a big part of making that happen, and we want to help people build those. Mike said, I wonder about incomparable sensory stimuli such as odor, like essential oils, sounds, music through a headset, taste and flavor, food seasonings, and self-harm, such as cutting or smoking outside while giving attention to the city birds. I do not conduct self, e.g. hitting and cutting, usually excessive smoking outdoors and other avoidance behaviors. I think I see what you're saying, Mike. Yeah, so self-harm or even just like more broadly like risky behaviors can look like a lot of different things for a lot of different people. And so this goes back to like culture and context too, because smoking, like from a scientific perspective, we know that smoking cigarettes isn't the best thing for you, right? And so if you're a person who wants to stop smoking and find other ways to meet the need that smoking is meeting for you, then like that's a place where we might introduce harm reduction strategies to figure out how to reduce smoking and introduce other coping strategies. But also, it's legal for you to smoke cigarettes if you're an adult. And the kind of harm that it causes might be an acceptable level of risk for you, right? So that kind of becomes something that's like up to you as like an adult. How do you want to deal with that, and do you consider it a risky behavior for yourself? Isabel asks, question, can you please explain who makes up the steering committee? Is it ASAN steering committee? I'm interested to understand who these folks are. Yeah, so it's not just, so I'll back up for a second. So ASAN, we're a partner of the Link Center, which means that our organization, along with lots of other organizations, we like help the Link Center like meet its goals and mission. The steering committee is made up of people from all over the country, from all different backgrounds and experiences. The thing that they all have in common is that they're dual diagnosed with an intellectual or developmental disability and a mental health disability. And if you want to learn more about the people who are on our steering committee, there are short bios, little like about them sections on our website that you can look at. And Stacy put that in the chat. Great. Okay, I'm going to turn it back to Noor for this last bit.
Absolutely. So going from protective factors, I think something that we highlight a whole bunch throughout this presentation is the idea of autonomy. So basically the idea that someone should get to make choices about their own lives. And a lot of people with intellectual or developmental disabilities and mental health disabilities have had choices taken away from them for a long time, and that this is a type of trauma. So trauma-informed care for people with these experiences means giving us choices. In the chat, we have some folks talking back and forth about if behavior is effective communication and if it's considered risky behavior. That is all pretty relative to the situation. So, for example, if what you're doing in a given situation is getting your point across and it's not hurting you or anyone else, in most cases, that's probably not going to be a risky behavior. And that's also depending on whether that message is getting received at the other end. It can be effective communication. And for people who only use action as a way to communicate, that also can definitely work as effective communication, absolutely. And specific actions are going to be really relative to where they're happening. So I saw someone mention ghosting, which is the idea of someone stopping communicating with someone else entirely without providing an explanation as to why. Ghosting can be an effective method of communication in the sense that the message it sends across to most people is, I don't want to continue talking to you. So in that way, yeah, that can be effective. It can be less effective if, for example, ending the communication without providing the explanation prompts the other person to continue reaching out rather than ending the communication. So, depending on the people in question, where that's happening, and if that's, for example, like a response to some sort of harm versus just someone dropping off communication for another reason, those can all be different factors. Yeah. Next slide. Oh, Alicia notes in the chat, I feel like anything can be labeled risky behavior. I got told sending emails at 3 a.m., even though I don't expect a response, is risky bad behavior. I don't hurt anyone. Yeah, no, that's also right. So something that we're trying to point out throughout this is basically that the idea of risk is really relative and that we want to define risky behavior as something that directly causes harm versus something that fits the common definition, which is just something that is seen as weird. Because weird is relative, and different cultures, different groups of people will have different ideas about what's considered weird or risky. So, yeah, you're correct in that currently people do often label stuff risky behavior in some cases that either isn't or that is in some cultures but not in others. And vice versa, that some stuff doesn't get labeled as risky that might be. And that's part of the problem, is that we have very vague ideas currently about what's considered risky, when in practice we should kind of drill down and think about all these questions. So when talking about autonomy, Alicia notes, we need to find ways to stop repeatedly traumatizing people by making them relive their trauma every time they go to get services. Kim notes that PTSD can trigger a meltdown and vice versa. We need to pay attention to the relationship between these things. Sometimes we just need space. Don't keep poking the bear. Monica notes, the system is not transparent with people receiving treatment. Doing that means we have to treat adults like adults and make them aware of the consequences. Micah notes, meltdowns are a part of life. Non-disabled people have bad days too. My emotions can be big sometimes, so we need to co-create plans to deal with meltdowns rather than trying to get them to go away entirely. Next slide, please. So along those lines, tools for providing choices. So the basics that need to be there before anything else, people need access to a communication method or a device of their choice. People need accessible information. People need the freedom to unmask and to stim without judgment. So some tools that can work with people to plan ahead of a crisis or to plan ahead of having a hard time. We have the Tips to Manage Triggers worksheet made by Max Barrows and Perry, which is on the Link Center's website. That basically helps people track what their triggers are and what they want to do when they come up. The worksheet, What to Do When I Don't Feel Okay, from Ren Kolaloni at Communication First. This is also up on the Link Center's resources page, and it is a plain language explanation of what a crisis is and what planning for one can look like and some options for that. Another resource we link here is Pod Mapping from Mia Mingus and the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective, which is a worksheet where people can plan basically what they want to happen in case of an emergency or in case of a crisis in general. So who they would want contacted, if anyone, what resources they might want, what aftercare they might want, that kind of thing. So to find the pod mapping worksheet, these will be linked with the presentation when it goes up on the website, but you can also find it by searching. Actually, let me just drop the link in the chat. That'll be easier. We also have the supported decision-making resource from ASAN's website, which talks about supported decision-making as a process and what all is covered. And I'm just going to go ahead and quickly look that resource up, and we'll drop it in the chat. In the meantime, let's go ahead and go to the next slide and start the group exercise.
So actually, this has been an amazing interactive hour and a half. So, and we're looking at the time, and we're not really feeling like we have enough time to really give the exercise justice. However, again, super interactive and feeling like you have all provided so much helpful input. So we thank you all who were engaging in the chat. And you really gave us all here at the Link Center lots of partners on with us, but you gave us all a lot to really think about. So I'm going to leave us with one question before we do the full closing here with you all. And I'm wondering what you have heard today that changes the way you think about the words risky behavior. So thinking about coming into today and then listening to everything Noor and Jules shared and hearing from others in the chat, what have you heard today that maybe changes the way you think about risky behavior? For me, made me think when said give tools work through behavior. How to handle bad behavior. How to support someone considering the aftermath and a place where to feel safe.
Stacy, we have one person who's raised their hand, so I'm going to unmute Danielle.
Okay. Go ahead, Danielle.
Danielle, you should be able to unmute your mic now.
I feel like I'm not alone. Like, cause a lot of times when you're going through this stuff, you don't realize how many more people are like you. I mean, in the IDD sense, you hear more about, the normal typical, but and that's why I love it. It makes you realize you're not alone, and that's a good feeling.
I love that. Thank you, Danielle, for saying that and sharing that you're not alone. And so we're glad that we could provide that space for you and for others. And I'm seeing that there's some other messages or notes here in the comments. How to support someone considering the aftermath and a place where to feel safe. Everything that has been said can be very relatable. I totally agree 100%. Thank you so much for addressing these. Hopefully we can find ways to resolve them. Thinking about it from the point of view of someone engaging in a behavior to communicate how they are feeling. Relative to person, culture, in that specific moment and place, so respond differently or not at all, but stand by. Having negating self-concept, it's complicated. Having positive and negative worldviews of people with lived disability experience. Often a form of communicating something deeper or in lieu of ability to verbalize. In kind we are more alike than not alike. That we need more safe places for the aftercare. It made me see that I am not alone, explains to me why people trying to make me fight for my autonomy of life over risky behaviors. I wish the people challenging my decision-making could hear this. Seems like they need training. And last, AI is weirding my keyboard. In-kind people are in-kind, likely people. Wonderful. Thank you all again for your thoughts and your comments. And now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, another partner of the Link Center, Tim Tunner. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Stacy, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm a middle-aged white guy, go by he, him pronouns, and I've got a short grayish brown beard and a little bit of hair left on my head. And I'm wearing a plaid button-down shirt with mostly reds, but a number of other different colors in it. So please, continue to add to the chat. And also, we'd like to know if you could tell us what are your go-to resources, trainings, websites, and where do you go to get information about navigating risky behaviors? Anything you could put in the chat would be appreciated. We'd like, this information will help us to develop materials and really inform us so that we can, create and help, better create services and supports for people. So please, if there's anything that you know of and can think of, anything that you resources, where do you go? Okay, thank you. So you go basically your hometown, your local information. Thanks. So please continue to put information in the chat, behavioral health support person or behavioral support person. I'll go ahead and move on to the next slide. So, and again, go ahead and if anything else comes to mind, please continue to add to the chat. So here is the schedule of both the past and upcoming shared learning groups. Per a question earlier in the chat, you can find all of the recordings, the transcripts, and materials from past events on the Link Center website, which is right here. And you can also find and register for upcoming shared learning groups on this website as well. The next topic, to let you know, will be moving through the justice system, and it will be in January. And you can visit the Link Center's website at any time. The website, the address and link were here. And we also have a quick evaluation that we hope that you will complete for us. On the screen is a QR code that you can scan with your phone. We just put it in the chat, and it will also pop up when we close the meeting today. And then it will also be sent out to everyone in an email afterwards. So we want to make sure whatever's the easiest way for you to fill it out. We want to make sure to get your feedback. It really helps us to make improvements and adjustments. So thank you again for participating today. A really special thank you to our colleagues at the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, Jules and Noor. And we'd also like to thank members of the Link Center Steering Committee for your time, very valuable time, and your input for these shared learning groups. Thank you also to the ACL, the Administration for Community Living, and to all of the partners who've contributed to the preparation and content for this meeting. So that is all we have for today. I hope everyone has a really wonderful afternoon, and thank you very much.